Well, then we're going to switch language here again and do this next talk in English. And I would like to welcome Andrew Child. Please give him a welcome. Well, hello, Andrew. It's wonderful to have you with us. Where exactly are you?
Well, at the moment I am at home, which is in a very tiny little place in the bottom, in the sort of southeast corner of Wyoming in the United States.
So it's afternoon where you are, I guess, then.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. It's very echoey.
Okay. Let's see if they can do something about the sound. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's better now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
sorry.
No, it's much easier if we actually hear each other. I think that will be good for everyone. I thought I'd just start by giving the audience here at the Swedish Crime Fiction Festival in Sundsvall a quick introduction to your career as a crime writer before we start. And Andrew Child has a background in theater and telecom, and he published his first crime novel in 2009. And since then, you published a total of 8 crime novels in 3 different series, plus 1 standalone, all under your real name, I think, Andrew Grant. But now you're here as Andrew Child to talk about how you are successively taking over your brother Lee Child's Jack Reacher series, as he is planning to retire from writing this series that he's been working on since 1997. And there were already 24 books in this series before you became involved, and now the 25th, The Sentinel, which the 2 of you have written together, is out in Swedish with the title Vaktposten. And the second co-written novel, Better Off Dead, is already out in English. And the idea is that you will eventually take over completely and write the Reacher novels by yourself. So being what is sometimes called a continuation writer, that is taking over someone else's fictional universe and characters and create new stories with them, that's not an easy task. Our most famous example here in Sweden would be David Lagercrantz, who took over after Stig Larsson and wrote 3 more novels about Lisbeth Salander and Mikael Blomkvist with mixed success, I would say. But maybe we shouldn't even call you a continuation writer, since you are actually writing the novels together with Lee Child at the moment. But how did you end up being involved in writing about Jack Reacher? How did that start?
Well, I'm happy to tell you all about that. But first of all, let me just say it's a huge honor and pleasure to be part of the Swedish Crime Writing Festival. I was delighted when I received the invitation, and I just wish that I could be there with you in person, because nice as it is at home, I would much rather be with you. So yeah, thank you for having me as a guest. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the idea of the continuation, and it's a funny thing to really try to define that, because what we're doing is a little different from what normally happens. You know, the normal situation would be that the original author unfortunately passes away, and then somebody, you know, be it a relative or somebody in the literary estate, will decide that there's still potential left in the series and that it would be a good idea to have more books. And I actually had a couple of friends who had done that kind of thing. A good friend of mine wrote some of the continuation Robert Ludlum books, for example. And so, you know, I'd been aware of it. Peripherally been aware of the idea, but I'd never thought of doing it myself at all. The way it happened, it's kind of strange, because with Lee being my brother, some of the time we see each other a lot, and sometimes we're away apart for a long period of time, particularly when books come out, because of course that's a very busy period of time. Or if you're in the midst of writing, you're going to be locked away in your office, you know, typing like crazy. So I hadn't seen him for a little while. And the last of the books that I wrote under my real name was being published in the United States. And so it was back before COVID, when you could still do things in person much more easily. So there was going to be a launch event for my book, which was going to be down in Denver, Colorado, in the United States. That's about 2 hours away from where we live. So I invited him to come, and he said he would. So we drove down there together. We did the event, and then he asked me to drive back, and I didn't realize at this point I was being set up at all. I just thought he didn't want to drive, because it was January, it was late at night, probably weather that Swedish people would find completely normal, but in the United States, people were a little panicking. It was what we call a ground blizzard, where you've got snow and ice blowing straight across in front of the car. And I wasn't sure how it was going to go. I thought, we could quite easily wind up crashing into a ditch here. I don't know if we're going to get home or not. So I was concentrating very carefully on the driving. And after about an hour of the drive, Lee said to me, "So I'm thinking of retiring." I was just completely taken by surprise. It was a shock to me. And looking back, if I'd have been a bit nicer, I probably would have said to him, "Yes, that's a great idea. You've written 24 books, you've worked incredibly hard, you've given pleasure to people all over the world. You should absolutely take some time for yourself, relax, enjoy yourself." But of course, I was thinking as a Reacher fan. So instead I said to him, "Wait a minute, you can't retire. What about Reacher?" And he said to me, "Well, I thought maybe you could start writing with me." And the reason he chose that time to ask me was knowing that I'd be focused on the driving and the terrible storm. I wouldn't just have an instinctive reaction. It would take a while for the idea to sink in and for me to come up with a considered response. So that was really how the idea came about. And from that, a few other things followed. So, for example, you mentioned that I now write as Andrew Child. And the reason we did that was that we wanted all the Reacher fans out there to feel comfortable that this wasn't a sudden change, that nothing really was going to be different, other than hopefully some new life was getting breathed into the series, and that it would be able to continue for longer. So I can't even remember who it was now. Somebody suggested, well, if we want to reassure people that you are both brothers and that you're going to be working together, it would be less confusing if you had the same name. So I said, fine, I don't care. Because actually, right from the start, Lee has always said it's not about the writer, it's about the character. He always wanted people to think about new Reacher book, not the new Child, or not even really the title necessarily, just the new Reacher. So, hopefully the transition from just him to both of us to just me, hopefully we can handle that without really anybody even noticing. If you didn't see, my sort of private goal is that if you went into the bookshop to buy the book and the cover was missing, if it had fallen off somewhere and you only had the book, nothing to tell you the names of the authors, that you could read the book and you wouldn't even know there'd been a change, because it's not really about Lee, it's not really about me, it's about Reacher.
So what do you think has been the biggest challenge to so far writing the Reacher books? Because it must be very different from when you write yourself and you can, make up all the characters and...
Absolutely. It has been a big challenge, and it's been a big change for me. The most important thing really was that when I was writing my own books, I never outlined them continuously. I didn't do a beginning to end outline with every single scene and every single detail mapped out. But I did always like to know a little bit about what was, I'd like to have a good idea of where I was going. Whereas Lee is famous for not outlining at all. He refuses to outline. It doesn't mean that the books aren't planned. It just means that the planning, instead of all happening at the beginning and then switching to a completely different stage where you just execute, he distributes that planning all the way throughout the whole book. So every decision the characters make is almost made in real time by the writer. And that was the biggest challenge for me, because it's really quite an uncomfortable way to work. It's like walking on a tightrope, but with no safety net. And, most people have some kind of an outline as a safety net, so they know that even if they stumble, there's something that they can rely on. Whereas working with Lee, there isn't. And so when we started The Sentinel, there would be times where we would finish a scene or finish a paragraph or a chapter. We'd be happy with it. So I would say to him, okay, so what happens next? And he'd say, I don't know. And the first time he did it, I thought he was teasing me. I thought he was joking. But it was just because, he will write a section, then decide what happens next. Write that section, then decide what happens next. So that switch was the most difficult thing for me, convincing myself that you can write that way and that you're not going to fall off the tightrope. You are going to get to the other side and it's going to be okay. So that was the biggest challenge. And I think the second biggest was all the books I wrote on my own. I made a conscious effort not to sound like him. I didn't want people to pick up my books and think, oh, he's just trying to pretend to be his brother. I wanted them to sound complete, even though they were still crime fiction and they had similar characters. I wanted it to sound different. I wanted if there was no cover on the book and someone picked one up, I wanted them to be able to say, oh yeah, this is an Andrew Grant book or this is a Lee Child book. But of course, once I started to write with Lee, I had to change 180 degrees. And instead of trying to sound different, I had to try to sound identical. So that was then another challenge.
You said that the ambition was to make it go seamless, the change, and to so that readers wouldn't notice any difference. But don't you have anything you want to do with the Jack Reacher character now when you will eventually get hold of him? Like if there are any themes or that you want to write about, or maybe you want to teach him how to use a smartphone or something. Do you have any?
That's a really good question. That's very interesting, because actually when we started to write The Sentinel, the one thing that Lee said he wanted to do was he felt that over the years he thought maybe 10 years ago Reacher was in just the right spot in terms of being behind the curve with the technology, because readers found it quite endearing. It wasn't as if he was streets ahead of them. He was maybe just a little bit behind them, and they thought that was nice. But then he kept him there, and time has moved on. So he felt that being behind the curve had gone too far. He said to me, when we write the first one together, what he was keen on was moving Reacher into a more up-to-date technological environment. Not suddenly making him an expert or anything like that, but just making it so that he wasn't quite so far behind. And so, I thought about that, and I said, yeah, I can see why you would want to do that, and what why that would be important. But what I also said to him was that another change that I've noticed looking at the whole of the 24 books that he wrote was that back in the early books, Reacher was really funny. He was witty. He was sarcastic. And we all know that Reacher can beat anyone in a fight, that he can figure out any puzzle, that he can, you can't outsmart him or outfight, So, but what we had lost as the books progressed and Reacher became less and less and less talkative was we had lost this whole aspect of him, this whole an extra string to his bow had disappeared, because he in the early books could destroy somebody verbally as well as physically or mentally or anything else. And on top of that, it was funny. It was a joy to read. I remember reading, I think it was the fourth Reacher book. There was a absolutely hilarious section where Reacher was riding in a car with another character who turned out to be bad, and he just completely obliterated this character, but only with words. And I said to Lee, if we're going to step a little bit forward in terms of the technology, I want to balance that by also taking the other step back to recapture that humor and that wittiness that there used to be. And he was quite surprised. He hadn't really even noticed that it had changed, because for him, it was just a gradual book by book, year by year shift that he hadn't done deliberately. And it sort of stopped in his tracks a little bit. And he said, well, hang on a minute, I hadn't really even noticed that I'd done that. But yeah, you're right, we should. So what we did with the Sentinel, the first one that we wrote together, was we did, I think, move Reacher to a point where he's at least using a cell phone.
Because that's actually one of my favorite things about him in the Sentinel, that kind of quirky thing that in Sweden we talk about it as someone being a language police. When he knows always what's the correct expression is, and he uses that to he corrects the bad guys to psych them out. And I love that about him.
Well, thank you. And that's something that I would like to continue as we move forward into the ones that I write on my own.
What would be your own favorite thing about Jack Reacher, about the character?
That's again a very hard question, because I like so many things about him.
But if you can only name like one.
I think the most important thing about Reacher is the fact that he always leaves. At the end of the story, when all the wrongs have been righted and everything has been set straight, he always leaves. And I think that is the most important thing, because if you imagine yourself as one of the characters in a Reacher story, you imagine that you're in trouble for some reason, you're desperate, a stranger arrives and puts everything straight, which is such an archetypal story. It's been around since the beginning of the human race. That is fantastic, but it only works because he leaves. Imagine if he moved in next door and you saw him every time you went out of your house, every time you were coming home from work, or you bump into him in the coffee shop or at the cinema. It wouldn't be the same. He would just be another person then. And you'd probably feel awkward because you wouldn't know. Are you supposed to be grateful? Are you supposed to buy him his coffee? You wouldn't know what to do. So the fact that he leaves, I think, is the thing that really makes him who he is.
Yeah, I think that's also a very interesting thing about this series, because we talked to so many authors during the festival now, and they all talk about these long arcs over several books and so on. But in this series, you can actually pick any book and read it. It doesn't matter. You don't need to read them in order, because there is a new story every time, and Jack Reacher doesn't really change, or he doesn't have people in his life, very many who changes. And so they're all like very independent.
They are, I think that's a very important thing about the series, but for two reasons. One is that Reacher is very consistent. He doesn't change from book to book. So when you pick up the new Reacher, or even an old Reacher, if you'd missed one for some reason, you know what you're going to get. You know what Reacher is going to do. I think that's really important. And the second thing is that the way that the Lee planned it out originally, with having Reacher as a former military policeman, so somebody who doesn't have a job any longer and who doesn't have a house, he can go anywhere and he can get involved in anything. And so, if you look at the Sentinel, where we did bring in all of these modern themes like ransomware and cybercrime and so on, then, when he wrote the first Reacher book, none of those things had ever been thought of. They were, hadn't been invented yet. And so by keeping things so flexible, it gives us endless opportunities to put Reacher wherever we need him, so that he can deal with whatever themes or whatever issues we feel like addressing in any given year. And actually, one thing that I realized the other day when I was thinking about it was character development in the Reacher series actually works in reverse, because Lee wrote a few prequels when Reacher was still in the army, when he was younger, and he did the same thing with some short stories. And so the funny thing about those is that you do see Reacher as a slightly different person, but he's not growing and developing. You're rewinding time and showing him when he was younger, perhaps a little more naive, a little less cynical, a little less knowledgeable, because he hasn't had all of those experiences yet. So it's a really, I think, interesting twist on character development, that you have it, but it only works in reverse with the books that were set before Killing Floor.
I think our time here is almost up, but what does the plan look ahead now? You have written 2 novels together with your brother. Has that been so much fun you want to continue doing that, and he's not going to retire now? Or is he still planning to retire, and how many books are you going to do together, and when are you going to take over?
Well, that's a great question. And, it'd be good if he was here, because I'm sure he would give a different answer, because I really have enjoyed working with him. It's been so great. I mean, getting to do for your job something that you love and getting to do it with your brother, it doesn't get better than that. I've had such a fantastic couple of years, and actually we're working on the 3rd one together at the moment. But the thing is, I think he really does want to retire. He's serious about it.
Yeah.
He's got lots and lots of things that he couldn't do during all of the years he was so busy. So he really wants to retire. So we're certainly doing the 3rd one together. When we get to the end of that, we may or may not work together on the 4th one. Probably we will. And then I think at that point, we'll decide whether he wants to step back all the way.
Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight and talking to us about all these interesting things about the Jack Reacher series. And hopefully you can come here in person some other year. We'd love to see you here.
I would absolutely love to come in person, and thank you so much for the time you've taken and the wonderful questions. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew Child. Då var det allt för oss här ikväll. Imorgon så är vi
Svenskan mycket långsamt, eller jag förstår inte.